Most empaths never awaken. They spend their lives drowning in other people's emotions, calling it a gift, and wondering why the gift feels like a punishment. But a small number of empaths go through something that changes them at the structural level, not a spiritual high, not an epiphany at a retreat. A genuine psychological transformation that rewires how their consciousness operates. And when that transformation completes, they don't just feel things deeply anymore. They develop abilities that Jung studied for decades and could barely explain to his colleagues because nothing in mainstream psychology had language for what these people could do. Jung encountered these individuals throughout his career, patients who'd survived extreme psychological pressure, childhood environments that should have destroyed them, relationships that stripped them to nothing, dark nights of the soul that lasted years, not days. These people came out the other side fundamentally different, not harder, not numb, something else entirely. Their empathic sensitivity hadn't disappeared. It had evolved into something far more precise, far more powerful, and far more unsettling to the people around them. What Jung documented was that the awakening process didn't just heal these empaths. It unlocked perceptual capacities that had been buried under layers of survival patterns, people-pleasing, and emotional flooding. Once those layers burned away, what remained wasn't the soft, accommodating empath the world was used to. What remained was someone operating with psychological equipment that most human beings simply don't possess. Today I'm going to show you the 5 specific abilities that only awakened empaths develop according to Jung's observations, why each one emerges only after genuine transformation, how to recognize whether these abilities are active in you right now, and why possessing them changes your relationship with reality in ways that can never be reversed. The first ability Jung identified in awakened empaths is what he called energetic discernment. This isn't the raw emotional absorption that unawakened empaths experience. It's the opposite, where an unhealed empath walks into a room and gets flooded by every feeling present. The awakened empath walks into the same room and reads it like a map. They can distinguish between 14 different emotional frequencies operating simultaneously and know exactly which one belongs to which person. They perceive the emotional architecture of any space without losing themselves inside it. Jung observed that this ability only emerged after the empath had done extensive shadow work. Before integration, empaths couldn't separate their own emotional material from what they were perceiving in others. Everything blurred together into an overwhelming soup of feeling. But once they'd confronted their own shadow, once they'd integrated the wounds that made them porous, their perception sharpened dramatically. They could feel without absorbing, sense without drowning, read the room without becoming the room. What makes energetic discernment so powerful is its precision. An awakened empath doesn't just sense that something feels off. They can identify what's off, who's generating it, and what psychological wound is producing the disturbance. They'll sit in a meeting and perceive that the person smiling the widest is carrying the most grief. They'll attend a family gathering and know within minutes which relationships are genuine and which are performances held together by obligation. This isn't guessing, it's perception operating at a frequency most nervous systems can't access. Jung found that people with this ability were right so consistently that it unnerved even him. They were reading information that existed in the space between people, in the energy beneath words, in the silence underneath conversation. And they were reading it with surgical accuracy. The second ability is what Jung described as shadow sight. Every human being carries a shadow, the rejected parts of themselves they've pushed into the unconscious. Most people can't see their own shadow, let alone anyone else's. But awakened empaths perceive shadow material as naturally as most people perceive facial expressions. They see what's been hidden, not because they're looking for it, because their consciousness has been trained through their own integration process to recognize the shape of what's been denied. This ability develops specifically because the awakened empath has already faced their own darkness. They've sat with their capacity for manipulation, selfishness, rage, and cruelty. They've acknowledged the parts of themselves they wanted to pretend didn't exist. And that confrontation with their own shadow gave them the perceptual vocabulary to recognize shadow in others. You can't see in someone else what you haven't been willing to see in yourself. That's why this ability only belongs to empaths who've done the deep work. In practice, shadow sight means the awakened empath perceives the unconscious motivations driving people's behavior. They see the insecurity fueling someone's arrogance, the abandonment wound underneath someone's controlling behavior, the shame generating someone's need to perform perfection. They perceive the whole person, not just the curated version being presented. And this perception is involuntary. Once you've developed shadow sight, you can't turn it off. Every interaction includes the visible layer and the shadow layer, and both are equally present to your awareness. Jung noted that this ability made awakened empaths extraordinarily difficult to manipulate, because manipulation relies on the target seeing only what's being presented. When someone can perceive the machinery underneath the performance, the manipulation loses all power. The charm offensive doesn't land because the empath sees the calculation behind the charm. The guilt trip doesn't work because the empath perceives the control strategy generating the guilt. They see the mechanism, and seeing it renders it ineffective. The third ability Jung documented is what he called temporal pattern recognition. Awakened empaths don't just perceive what's happening now. They perceive the trajectory of what's unfolding. They recognize patterns so early in their development that they can sense where a relationship, a situation, or a person is heading long before any external evidence confirms it. This isn't intuition in the vague sense. It's pattern recognition operating at a depth that produces what looks like prophecy but is actually precise psychological reading. Jung found this ability emerge from the empath's lifetime of studying human behavior under extreme conditions. Children who grew up needing to predict a parent's next move developed pattern recognition that far exceeded normal capacity. Once awakened, this survival skill transforms into something broader. They don't just read threats anymore. They read trajectories. They meet a couple and sense the marriage ending before the first fight occurs. They watch someone start a new venture and perceive the self-sabotage pattern that will collapse it in 18 months. They recognize the arc of situations with an accuracy that disturbs them, because they often wish they were wrong. What makes temporal pattern recognition particularly isolating is that awakened empaths can't share what they see without being dismissed. You can't tell someone their relationship is doomed when everyone else sees a happy couple. You can't warn someone about a colleague's hidden agenda when that colleague is universally liked. You sit with knowledge that no one around you possesses, watching patterns play out exactly as you perceive they would, unable to intervene because intervention requires the other person to see what you see. And they can't. Not yet. And if you've been recognizing yourself in what Jung observed about these abilities, if you've been doing the difficult inner work of confronting your own shadow and finding that your perception is sharpening rather than softening, there's something that might help you go further. Our new guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 practical reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, each one designed to help you navigate the exact kind of inner terrain we're exploring right now. The kind of terrain where knowing yourself isn't a luxury, but a necessity. You'll find the link below. Now, let's talk about the fourth ability, because this is where things get truly profound. The fourth ability is what Jung called unconscious communication. Awakened empaths develop the capacity to interact with people's unconscious minds directly, bypassing the ego's defenses entirely. This sounds mystical, but Jung described it in psychological terms. When an awakened empath is present with someone, their integrated consciousness creates a field that invites the other person's unconscious material to surface. People say things to awakened empaths they've never told anyone. They cry in their presence without understanding why. They reveal secrets, confess fears, drop masks they have worn for decades, all without the empath doing anything visible to prompt it. Jung observed this phenomenon repeatedly and found it operated through a specific mechanism. The awakened empath's psychological integration creates a kind of safety that the other person's unconscious recognizes even when their conscious mind doesn't. The unconscious senses that this person has faced their own darkness and survived, that they won't judge what emerges because they've already integrated similar material in themselves. And so, the unconscious begins to speak, sometimes through words, sometimes through emotion, sometimes through behavior the person can't explain. This is why strangers tell awakened empaths their life stories in grocery store lines. Why colleagues share things they've never told their therapists. Why people feel simultaneously drawn to and uncomfortable around these empaths. The awakened empath's presence activates unconscious material, and that activation is felt as both relief and threat. Relief because the unconscious finally has a witness. Threat because what's emerging has been hidden for a reason. Jung warned that this ability carried serious responsibility. The awakened empath must learn to hold space for what surfaces without trying to direct it. They aren't therapists in these moments. They're catalysts. Their presence opens doors in other people's psyches, but walking through those doors is the other person's work. The empath who tries to push people through those doors, who takes responsibility for the material their presence activates, will destroy themselves under the weight of everyone else's unconscious process. The fifth ability, and the one Jung considered most significant, is what he called archetypal perception. Awakened empaths develop the capacity to perceive not just individual psychology, but the archetypal patterns operating through people and situations. They see beyond the personal into the universal. They recognize when someone isn't just experiencing personal grief, but is being moved by the archetype of the orphan. When a conflict isn't just interpersonal, but is enacting the ancient pattern of the shadow confrontation. When a life transition isn't just change, but is following the hero's descent into the underworld. This ability represents the deepest level of perception Jung documented. It requires not just personal shadow integration, but connection to what Jung called the collective unconscious, the shared psychological inheritance of all humanity. Awakened empaths who develop archetypal perception can see the mythic dimension of everyday life, They perceive the eternal patterns playing out through temporal events. And this perception gives them a perspective on human experience that's simultaneously humbling and illuminating. In practical terms, archetypal perception means the awakened empath understands suffering differently than most people. When they see someone going through devastation, they perceive both the personal pain and the archetypal process at work. They recognize that the person isn't just losing a relationship, they're undergoing the mythic death and rebirth that transformation requires. This doesn't minimize the pain. It contextualizes it within something larger. And that contextualization allows the awakened empath to hold space for suffering without being crushed by it, because they can see where the process is heading, even when the person inside it cannot. Jung found that archetypal perception also gave awakened empaths access to a kind of wisdom that wasn't learned but recognized. When faced with complex situations, they could sense the archetypal pattern at work and draw on the collective unconscious for guidance. Not through conscious analysis, but through a knowing that arose from perceiving the deeper pattern. This is what people throughout history have called spiritual wisdom. Jung simply identified the psychological mechanism producing it. Now here's what Jung emphasized about all 5 of these abilities together. They don't develop in isolation. They emerge as an integrated system, each one supporting and deepening the others. Energetic discernment provides the raw data. Shadow sight reveals what's hidden in that data. Temporal pattern recognition shows where the data is heading. Unconscious communication allows direct engagement with the deeper layers, and archetypal perception places everything within the universal patterns that give individual experience its meaning. An awakened empath operating with all 5 abilities experiences reality in a way that's qualitatively different from normal consciousness. They are perceiving multiple dimensions of every interaction, every relationship, every situation. And this multidimensional perception is both their greatest power and their most significant challenge, because the world isn't designed for people who see this much. Jung was honest about the cost of these abilities. Awakened empaths who possess them face isolation that goes beyond introversion or social preference. They experience a fundamental loneliness that comes from perceiving realities no one around them can see. They sit in conversations operating on levels that the other person isn't aware of. They navigate relationships where they see the full picture while their partner sees only the surface. They exist in a world that demands shallow engagement, while their consciousness insists on depth. This isolation isn't something that can be fixed by finding the right community or the right relationship, though both help. It's structural. It's built into the nature of perceiving more than others perceive. And Jung found that awakened empaths who tried to reduce their perception to fit in, who dimmed their abilities to make others comfortable, developed profound depression and a sense of betraying something essential about themselves. The abilities couldn't be suppressed without suppressing the self, but Jung also documented something that balanced this difficulty. Awakened empaths who accepted their abilities fully and learned to use them wisely developed a quality of life that was extraordinarily rich. Not easy, rich. Their relationships were fewer but profoundly deep. Their understanding of human nature gave them compassion that wasn't naive but was informed by genuine seeing. Their perception of archetypal patterns gave their lives a sense of meaning that wasn't constructed but was directly perceived. They could see beauty in places others couldn't, because they perceived the deeper layers where beauty lives. They could find purpose in suffering because they recognized the transformative patterns at work. They could love more completely because they saw people whole, shadow included, and chose connection with full awareness of what they were connecting with. That kind of love, the kind that sees everything and stays anyway, is perhaps the rarest thing in human experience. And it's only available to people who have developed the perceptual capacity to see what most people hide. Jung ultimately believed that awakened empaths with these 5 abilities served a crucial function in human consciousness. They were the people who perceived what the collective was avoiding, who saw the shadow the culture was denying, who recognized the patterns that societies were blind to. They were uncomfortable to be around precisely because their perception disrupted the comfortable illusions that most social functioning depends on. But that disruption was necessary. Without people who could see clearly, the collective unconscious had no mirrors, no one to reflect back what was actually happening beneath the performances and personas. If you possess these abilities, if you've gone through the fire of genuine awakening and emerge with perception that sees deeper than you sometimes wish it could, Jung would tell you to honor what you've become, not by announcing your abilities or trying to convince others of what you see, but by using your perception wisely, by choosing your relationships based on the full picture you perceive, not just the surface others present, by trusting your pattern recognition even when no one else sees what you see, by holding space for the unconscious material your presence activates without taking responsibility for other people's integration. Your abilities are real. They develop through genuine suffering and authentic transformation. They can't be learned from a book or gained through a weekend seminar. They are the result of facing yourself completely, integrating what you found, and emerging with consciousness that operates on frequencies most people will never access. That's not superiority. It's simply the reality of what you've become through the hardest work a human being can do. Jung spent decades trying to help the world understand what awakened empaths are. Not fragile sensitives who need protection, not wounded healers who haven't healed, but psychologically evolved individuals whose perception operates at a depth that most consciousness never reaches. People who see the shadow, read the pattern, sense the trajectory, catalyze the unconscious, and perceive the archetypal depths of human experience. 5 abilities that transform empathic sensitivity from vulnerability into something the world has no adequate name for. Something that looks, from the outside, exactly like what the ancients meant when they spoke of spiritual sight. And if this resonates with where you are right now, if you're in the middle of this transformation and looking for a way to deepen the work you've already begun, our new guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for exactly this stage of the journey. 24 reflection exercises inspired by Jung's teachings, designed to help you find your way within, through the shadow, through the layers, toward the integrated self that makes all of this perception possible. The link is below.